Hello, and welcome to another video on New Testament material. In this case, we're going to continue plugging away at the Pauline epistles, and at this point, I'm actually going to cover some material from 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, which actually are two epistles that Paul writes once he actually has begun his third missionary journey, which lasted from approximately 53 to 57 AD, and is covered in Acts 18:23 to 21:17. So after he'd already written 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and then most likely is Galatians, if you prefer this kind of later date for Galatians, which would take it right around 53 AD or so. He did a little bit of traveling and wrote 1 Corinthians in 55 AD before the spring, that is, before Pentecost. And in that case, I think wrote it from Ephesus. And then in 2 Corinthians 2, verse 13, it states there that he left after not finding sufficient comfort, not being with one of the brothers, I believe it was Titus. He went off to Macedonia, and from Macedonia still felt inspired and compelled to write another letter to the Corinthians to follow up on some previous topics and matters that he'd addressed, and he wrote that letter from Macedonia. But 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians are some pretty significant letters. They address some issues of worship and of church life and of discipleship in light of the life of the body of Christ that are pretty unique among a lot of these epistles. Now, 1 Corinthians, again, it was written in 55 AD toward the close of Paul's 3-year residency, I think, in Ephesus. And you can see that in Acts 20, verse 31, and even back in Acts 16, 5 through 9, gives you some background on Ephesus as well. But the letter actually alternates between oral reports to which Paul is responding, and then his own responses to a letter that he received from the Corinthians. So there's an oral report which is first mentioned in 1 verse 10, and that's addressed until 4 verse 17, and then it picks up again in 4:18 to 6:20. Then he makes an allusion to the letter that they had written him, and that's from 7:1 through 40, and then again from 8:1 to 11:1. Then it shifts back to the oral reports, that is, reports that he's heard orally, messages he's received about the Corinthians in 11:2 to 34, and then it goes back to the Corinthian letter in 12:1 to 14:40. Then we're back to oral reports in 15:1 through 58, the well-known chapter on the resurrection, and then it goes back to the Corinthian letter right at the end in chapter 16, 1 through 12. So Paul alternates between these different issues and topics that really emerge from the complexities and challenges of life. But in each case, Paul draws out the theological implications of their behavior. So he doesn't just simply give them practical advice, but he grounds all of it in what's really a very profound spirituality centered on the norm of love, which really comes to the fore in the later chapters, but for sure, in a central way, the cross, the wisdom of the cross. Those two things are, you could say, kind of the theological / spiritual pillars of the letter. Now, it seems true that there's an influence of Hellenistic philosophy, literature, a Hellenistic theology, that was kind of adapted. It was accommodated, and the church there, it sounds, had a difficult time both responding to that and then also kind of digesting and understanding or comprehending the teachings of their Christ-centered faith. In some ways, there's this kind of interesting sort of blend or clash between them, a combination of those two things. In other words, there seemed to be some pretty significant confusion. But nonetheless, the environment of Corinth was a significant one with respect to how pressing and how much perhaps pressure I should say, could be experienced by a disciple in their everyday life. It was a very, very significant commercial city. It had been established, or I guess I should say reestablished as a colony, a Roman colony, almost 100 years after Julius Caesar himself had founded it and established it, and it had been eventually, that is, it was destroyed, and the Romans built up sort of a new colony on its ruins. But this is a place where competition for honor, status, and power was the preoccupation of most people. So it was fairly clear, I think, from Paul's perspective, once he started realizing what was going on there, that that kind of intense running with the Joneses, as you were, the ancient, I should say, the late antiquity version of running with the Joneses, or keeping up with the Joneses, was it conflicting with the central convictions of love and selflessness and kind of an equal regard in the body of Christ. So there were a few people that seemed to have been, of course, confused about the resurrection. Again, there seemed to be kind of, this Hellenistic, perhaps, version of the resurrection teachings that espoused a bodiless resurrection, right? One where there was no physical resurrection at all. And it was because there was an emphasis on gnosis, right? On knowledge, on what it is that's known can elevate your spirituality to new levels. And that divinity was attained by grasping these important teachings. And then at the same time, there was an importance on Sophia, on knowledge, on not just knowledge, but on wisdom as well. That is, being able to display, especially through your rhetoric, through your ability to construct arguments and influence others. This was a sign of great wisdom. And those who had the greatest wisdom, of course, were the most highly regarded when it came to intellectual pursuits. These individuals seemed to be those who could grasp the thoughts of the gods. And that in other words, that really, I think, was at the root of one problem that Paul addresses, is the internal dissension in the church. He addresses that with the wisdom of the cross in 1:10 through 4:21. There are internal rivalries that in the church, people are scrambling for position, maybe on the basis of these kind of personality, these little personality cults within the fellowship. I imagine that people were claiming that such and such person, Apollos, Paul, Peter, have greater gnosis and Sophia than the others. So he addresses this in 2 verse 12, that this is the spirit of the world, is what's actually running the show. It's the wisdom of the world. He also mentions that in 1:20 and 3:19, the wisdom of this age in 2 verse 6. And his response is to uproot this Sophia with a cross-centered community, that adopts Paul's own cruciform heart and way of life and practices. So the Greco-Roman symbols in that case, or mythology, are competing with the cross. And these displays of status through wisdom and knowledge clash with the power of weakness. Paul, in many ways, is trying to convey to them that there's weakness in power as they conceive power, and instead that needs to be countered with the power of weakness. So human Sophia is very partial. It's susceptible to self-deceit, is one of the points that Paul is making there. It's blinded by conceit and pride. But Paul, especially in kind of in 1:18 to 3:23, in that section, and in particular 1:19 and 2:9, he makes and then again, actually in verse 16 of chapter 2, in 3:19 and 20, those are actually 5 citations in which he actually quotes Scripture to make the point that humans cannot grasp God's wisdom through their own, in many ways you could say, selfish efforts or self-regarding efforts. Instead, God manifests power He does it. He shows it with humans, but he has done it primarily through his Son, most decisively and completely, and allowed him to be crucified. The apostles are regarded as weak and foolish, and assembling a church of nobodies and uniting them to this crucified Christ. This is what Paul is saying is actually a display of power. But it's power in weakness, not power as they conceive it. And not only is it a church of quote-unquote nobodies, but it's also Jesus, right? Jesus is for them their righteousness or justice and sanctification and redemption. I mean, all these incredibly powerful, you could say, events and processes don't really apply at all to the wisdom of the world, that as Paul sees it, right? So this is all, he then says, the work of the Spirit. It's not an orator's excellence. It's not a philosopher's, right, incisive thoughts or precision in philosophizing. It's the cross is the antidote to this human, right, this human tendency to self-glorification as he sees it. And Paul casts himself and Apollos just as servants. So again, he's taking the low road, while the others want to continue to elevate themselves through knowledge and wisdom. He says, I and Apollos are just field hands, in 3:6-9. And he identifies apostles as figures of shame, who are indistinguishable from the dregs of society, right, in 4:10-13. And apostles, at least those especially who were sent out, especially if sent out on imperial errands, such as ambassadors, were folks of quite a bit of standing and of prestige. So Paul says, hey, look, we're just a bunch of building contractors. He is completely trying to quash any egoism through his cross-centered or cruciform approach to life and ministry. And he's focused on serving other people. He wants to lead, in a sense, from below. The next section, in 5:1-6:20, he addresses some ethics, right, some action-oriented notions, but with Christ's lordship of the body in mind. And then there's three issues: incest, lawsuits, and in this case, it seems like visiting prostitutes, perhaps temple prostitutes. Paul insinuates that the church is just completely filled, riven with unnecessary strife that's fed by some unjustified pride. And these cases, and what he's actually doing is trying to subvert their claims to great wisdom and knowledge by showing that if you are involved with incest, lawsuits, and visiting prostitutes, this is showing your carnality, right? Your fleshiness, that is, your dependence on just simply letting your body run the show, your cravings and your passions apart from God. That's what he mentions as far as their carnality in 3:1. And he says, so therefore, this actually kind of punctures the bubble of their arrogance, and it reveals their completely groundless, groundless basis for boasting. He says, you have no grounds for boasting whatsoever, because rather than being high-minded and philosophically impressive, you are just very, very carnal people. So you can't even boast about that. Instead, you don't realize that in God's power there's a new sexual ethos, there's a new ethos even of possessions and of prestige. So he says there needs to be a complete transformation, and that's what he claims God can do through this washing, this sanctification, this justification. There's no whitewashing of sin here, but there's a transformation that he expects and knows that God will deliver. So in 5:5 and 6:2 and 6:14, in all of these cases, he actually uses eschatology, right? He uses this notion of God's transforming power entering the world, and is also a hope that God will complete what he has started in transforming their lives. So in 5:5, he talks about the incestuous man's spirit being saved on the day of the Lord. In 6:2, he mentions that the saints will judge the world and angels. So he's viewing this future happening that has already, in a sense, been confirmed in the present. And then in 6:14, that the body will be raised. Again, something to which they already are assured, Lord and is already breaking into their present life the power of the resurrection. Those three things, which are actually future-oriented, are used as backing and as justification for his own position against their behavior, to correct their behavior. It's a good question to ask ourselves: how deeply embedded are we in these eschatological notions when we advise one another? Then also he urges them: live like those who you really are. Live like those who are destined to be with Christ. Right? He mentions those things in 5:7 through 8 and 6:11. So he has this talk on celibacy, on divorce and marriage, and focuses that all on God's calling. In chapter 7, 1 through 40, Paul doesn't foist his own preferences to celibacy or singlehood on them. He just simply says, you have been called by God. In whatever situation you happen to be in, use that situation as if, as if it were just something that, like a vehicle, so to speak. You can use it for strengthening your own devotion to Christ, your own devotion to living out Christ's work, that is, in loving God and loving people, and in really in undoing the power of evil, the power of sin. So talk about God's call, or klesis, as he says, that's what's paramount. And they ought to live as these other statuses: being married, living in this or that place, having this or that kind of work. That's irrelevant compared to the breaking in of God's kingdom. Those things are important, but relative to God's kingdom, you might as well act as if you don't have it, right? And that's what he says in one of those puzzling passages. If you're married, act as if you're not. If you're this or that, act as if you're not. If you have possessions, act as if you're not. In other words, these things have no absolute hold on you. The absolute, it comes from God's call. Then he goes to a very interesting talk on idol food, and this he actually centers on Christ, 8:1 through 11:1. Again, this is a place where this was an environment where there are many deities to which you could pledge your allegiance. Paul asserts exclusive loyalty to God as Father and to Christ as Lord. So he says, yes, it's an environment where many people are actually visiting multiple deities in different temples. But in your case, this can't be. He says you can't compromise your witness to this one God, because it's something that in many ways would then belie your central conviction in the coming of Christ, and eventually, of course, in his resurrection. He also eventually starts talking in chapter 11 about worship and God's creation, and even the issue of head coverings, for example, in that chapter. He grounds his views on head coverings, which I won't go into, in his view of creation and of being in the Lord. God's saving work through Christ transcends society's gender hierarchy, as if men are superior to women. That doesn't apply. Women in this case are praying, and they're also making prophetic statements in the assembly, but it's done in a particular way. And in this case, the head coverings are something that would actually, in many ways, attract negative attention, maybe even shameful attention to the congregation. And so he considered in that point, let's not challenge things that in many ways are values that are trying to uphold dignified, at least, aspects of human life, humane sides of human life. Let's not contest those. The woman should have her head covered. It won't shame her husband. It won't shame herself. And so therefore, let's subscribe to that. The Lord's Supper and Christ's offering is also addressed later on in that chapter. And in that case, some of the disciples were importing some of the class divisions in that society. Those who were wealthier would eat at a table before anybody else, and they also ate more food than anybody else. And apparently that was going on in some of their own feasts and some of their own meals. And Paul points that out, that this is simply wrong. He then addresses in 12:1 to 14:40 gifts. spiritual gifts, spiritual persons, and worship. In this case, right, the Corinthians had a very limited view of gifts. They seemed to elevate a handful of spectacular gifts to this level of superiority, while the others were somewhat like second or third order, or unimportant, I suppose, with respect to the other gifts. But he wants to make it clear. He wants to correct their spiritual pride, even when it came to that point, and even the disorderly worship. He makes a very simple claim: all Christians are imbued with the Spirit and are therefore spiritual by virtue of their confession Jesus is Lord, right, in 12 verse 3. Only with the Spirit of Christ could you have said that. So that is, and lived in it, and also understand that you have a gift from the Spirit to use. And every Christian who is a Christian can say that. Right? He broadens the spectrum of these grace gifts as things that manifest the Spirit. Right, from verse 44 to 26. The Corinthians again have overlooked the theological implications of each issue. The diversity of gifts, of services, of ministry, right, of practices are distributed by the Spirit according to how the Spirit wills. Each person has a gift for the common good. And if each person has a gift for the common good, that means each person is needed. So no one should feel superior because of a particular kind of spiritual endowment. The Spirit decides who gets what according to the needs of the community, not the value of the recipient. All are encouraged to use this gift to build up the body of Christ. The segmentation really of the church into these different little cliques is really the byproduct of people using their different spiritual capacities as a pretext for then reinstating these divisions in the church. But in this case, it's almost like reinstating class divisions, but under the guise of spiritual classifications, right, of like spiritual abilities, or so as to elevate, right, some over others. So he lets them know in chapter 13, 1 through 13, that the fact of valuing one gift over another already betrays how completely devoid they are of love, right? It already conveys a defeat in that area. The gifts are no longer gifts if love is not present, is what he's trying to make clear. The issue is not whether a certain gift is more beneficial or stimulating or spiritual. The issue is whether love is radiated in exercising that gift, right? Love is embodied in the cross, and therefore it mandates that someone seeks honor only for not oneself, but for others. Right? Since almost every problem really in the church mentioned in this chapter, that is in 13, 4 through 7, is mentioned in the love passage, it really shows that I think Paul is trying to make a major claim here that love is really what's missing. That's the root issue, and a lot of it grows out of that. So he says, let's build up the church. That's really the touchstone for the ordering of the gifts in worship. When the speech gifts, for example, are all understood, including outsiders, right? Those are the most beneficial and most fruitful. Tongues and prophecy could be done in that case as well, 14, 26 through 40. But he said at that time there has to be someone who understands what this person speaking another language is saying. Even presently, right, when folks preach in certain churches, in our family of churches, and for example, like in Jerusalem or in other cities, there may be 3 or 4 other interpreters present, who can translate the language into what some others can understand. That's a beautiful thing when God's word can be conveyed in multiple languages at the same time. But anyway, this is something that has to be done correctly, and that's what Paul is trying to convey to them at that time. There are other issues involved here as far as the other gifts, but that's what he's, I think, trying to convey. And then lastly, we get to chapter 15, resurrection of the dead and God's creative power. The problem here is that the Corinthians cannot reconcile a bodily resurrection with a heavenly, right, a kind of a heavenly spirituality or a heavenly existence. They see, we don't know how that works. Right, in 15, 1 through 34, he addresses the reality of the resurrection. The rest of the chapter, he talks about how this is very much possible. In other words, also he makes the very logical claim that if Christ has not been raised, then what we're actually doing here is going to fall apart. It's not coherent anymore, because the resurrection is very much necessary for what we are claiming about God's power over death. And so it goes to a very, very beautiful section there about how a body that God enters into the world, for example, like a seed, is then given another body that's appropriate to this transformation that it receives from God. And he says, so just as the seed turns out to be this beautiful plant, God can take something that's perishable, our bodies, and grant it a new imperishable body. So he says it can be seen in a number of different ways. So there is a glorified body that God will and can provide, because there are, you could say, traces and hints of this in even in the world that God has created. Anyway, as we move to 2 Corinthians, I realize that this video is probably a bit too long, but if you've stuck around this long, you will get the benefit of some material on 2 Corinthians. The numerous literary and rhetorical strategies here of Paul are used to great effect. There's a number of people, of course, that have surmised over the years that this was 2 letters in one. This may be like a 2nd and 3rd Corinthians. There's a gentleman who argued at one point that there was the chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13 were a separate letter. Some have argued that there's 2 letters that have been combined. But one of the things that preoccupies Paul here is not just simply in the opening chapter where he makes those very stirring remarks about how comfort that fills up to one person in the fellowship overflows to others to provide comfort for them. Again, making clear that the spirituality we have is never in an independent or in an island. It's something that is meant to overflow, and you only have it to the degree that you've shared it. But there's a lot of concern about who these opponents are that Paul is speaking of. But the letter is very much bound up by a lot of apocalyptic way of speaking and discourse. With the apocalypse proper, 2 Corinthians does present this sort of cosmic reality. In some ways it has some similarities to Ephesians. But the life of a Christian, I think, is one of the points that he's making, is understood in terms of God's actions. Who God is, in terms of what He does in time, in our history. He said that's what he wants to direct their attention to doing, and to knowing that there is a powerful, weighty, you could say, unseen world in which God is acting as well. So Paul kind of reconfigures the world in terms of this sort of revelation of God in the Messiah. In 2 Corinthians 3, he wants to make clear even there that there's a lot of great stuff: knowledge, discipline, sacrifice, giving, authority, revelation. From 2 Corinthians 3 to the end of the letter, all those things are valued, but they're only valued in Jesus, from the perspective of the Messiah, in whom this new creation has come. There's just beautiful passages, powerful passages there about the importance of the new creation. That with that in mind, they'll realize that God will only take them from glory to glory as they live in this new creation life. In 2 Corinthians 4, he makes again some very compelling statements about human life being both transitory, being something that is unstable, ephemeral, but bound for glory as well. We hold treasures in these clay vessels, in chapter 4, I think verse 7. So our human failing eyes, in other words, have seen, as it says in the verse here, the knowledge of the light of the glory of God in the face of Jesus. Very powerful words there, very well put. And you can see that there's a sort of visionary possession of Christ's body that surpasses all of the revelations of the prophets of old: Elijah, Moses, all of these others. Ezekiel glimpsed in visions God's glory from afar, and instructed God's people accordingly. But the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord as it says in Ezekiel 1, is not, he said, that's been eclipsed, right, by God's light right here among us in Jesus. So Jesus seemed seemingly poor, right? But he's veiled. He's got this veiled and vulnerable glory, and this is something that, of course, turns into the resurrection. As a result, in other words, of all of this, of Jesus' appearing, of his transfiguration and then his resurrection, the world has changed. That's his main point. 2 Corinthians 5:17. This world is different now. God's people are taken up into this drama of the death and resurrection of Jesus, and this death and resurrection is working out its presence in the world even now, right, through his Spirit and especially through the church. And that's what he wants to make clear, right? In 2 Corinthians 6:17 through 18, he says, man, when God came through, he's making very clear a certain point. I will welcome you, and you shall be my sons and daughters. It says in 17b through 18. He then later on says, he was crucified in weakness, but raised by God's power. We are weak in him, but will live by his power. Paul, towards the end of the letter, is trying to convey the power of the resurrection. He's working it through different steps and different stages, so that they very much embrace it and know, and then also know that from his perspective, he wants them to get the right, especially in 2 Corinthians 7, wants them to get the right idea of what it means to lament, right, to grieve, to have godly sorrow, so as to really and truly embrace wonder and amazement. So he's trying to convey, as he does in 2 Corinthians 13, he wants to communicate to them that I'm building you up, right? I want to show you a correct foundation for your spirituality. He takes great pains in doing this in the initial chapters. At any rate, this is a 30-minute video. It's by far the longest, but I hope that it's benefited you in some way. In some sense, it actually only scratches the surface of what some of these letters could provide. But hopefully, it's a helpful overview for you.